What is Unepic? It's a side-scrolling RPG that follows the story of a man who goes to the bathroom and is then transported into a large underground dungeon from which he has to escape. Its gameplay is a mix of action platforming, Metroidvania-style exploration, and old-school dungeon crawling, but the sum of its parts isn't nearly as exciting as that might make it sound. The main reason the game is held back from excellence is its intrusive and generic aesthetic design. It starts off with a cutscene where a few friends are playing a tabletop role-playing game. Things like drinking beer and, quote, taking a piss are referenced to set the tone, and all of the artwork has a distinctly paint-by-numbers flavor to it. Visually, the game feels like just about everything you've ever seen before. When your character ends up taking that aforementioned piss, the lights in the bathroom don't seem to work, and he's transported to some sort of dank underground lair. "I think I'm pissing on the floor," he says, unwittingly giving us a very representative taste of the style of humor Unepic deploys throughout the experience. It's not particularly highbrow, nor is it delivered with any great sense of tone or timing, so it ends up falling flat, and no amount of nerd culture references, of which there are many, can turn that around.
Hey, an oil lamp. Hope that Belmont doesn't show up and start putting him out with his whip.
It's not just that the dialogue is generic, though, it's that it's almost totally unnecessary. The gameplay-focused bits of Unepic are fairly cohesively designed, and would have functioned aptly without the need for almost any dialogue at all. They would have shined somewhat brighter, in fact, if the story hadn't seen fit to take the player's focus away from the gameplay every so often. It does nothing to support the gameplay, and it's hardly of merit in its own right. The game would have been better without it.
Right.
And Harnakon?
Harnakin was chosen.
Speaking on the gameplay elements, it would be pretty accurate to say that they are primarily serviceable and not a step beyond. You spend your time in the game traversing 2D environments in the fashion of an action platformer, but the combat is pretty far from fast-paced like you might expect. Curiously, the game chooses to force you into a slower pace by continuously killing your character until you begin to question why you're dying so often. A quick assessment of the situation shows that you're likely not taking full advantage of the random loot you've acquired, and that perhaps you should invest some time into upgrades and stat building before going at it again, this time more slowly and thoughtfully. The game's strict adherence to giving at least some real value to its items and their use is welcome, and it helps drive the experience forward. Another piece of the Unepic experience is a vaguely addicting, narrow-minded desire to explore and unlock areas simply because the game lets you. There is very little narrative-driven incentive to participate in this quest, but there's something satisfying about lighting up every torch in a room and seeing its square on your map go from dark to light. It's this, the somewhat shallow, completionist desire within us all, that keeps you playing, and although there is some deeper satisfaction in upgrading your character with better items to best enemies, it takes a backseat to the simplistic need to, quote, collect all of the shiny things. Not a particularly meritorious basis for a relatively long game. Aside from equipment management and shallow exploration, though, the game feels fairly unfocused. It uses certain elements, like those aforementioned torches, to encourage exploration, but the almost complete lack of anything interesting to look at while doing that exploration is somewhat perplexing. The combat is interesting on the player side, but enemy designs tend to be pretty simplistic and don't really require you to do much aside from pick the right weapon and armor and then hit the attack button. There's very little need to switch weapons mid-battle, use scrolls or potions aside from healing-related ones, or strategically attack certain enemies before others. Boss fights are the occasional exception. So, Unepic doesn't do a great job of conforming to its own philosophies of exploration and satisfying combat, but it does take advantage of the somewhat valueless desire many people have to complete things, and an at least marginally satisfying equipment system adds a small token of entertainment only because they make the game hard enough to require your attention every so often. At times, it does feel a bit like these positive aspects came together by accident and that perhaps the entire effort was a bout of slapdash development, but in the end it doesn't really matter. The game can be fun, but usually isn't, and makes very little effort to support its own internal desires with quality design. Because of all the things I just said, Unepic gets a thumbs down. Unepic isn't easily recommended to anyone except for those with a strong urge to kill some time with a minimally engaging game that has very little going for it beyond tolerable gameplay. If you enjoy particularly lowbrow humor or teenage-level edginess, you may find something notable here as well, but most experienced gamers will likely want to stay away. Unepic is a game only for lovers of grinding, managing equipment, and doing monotonous tasks for extended periods of time. Everyone else should steer clear.